What you're currently watching might be the most frustrating build that I've tried to make work yet in Season 4. In the fall from grace of Season 3's excellence, where Sever Necromancer was almost considered S tier for how wildly powerful, tanky, fast, and enjoyable and just straight up cool the overall aesthetic of the build was, has now been relegated, I think, straight to F tier, and that's only if Blood Surge and Bloodlance are as bad as I currently think that they are after we get some testing in. But let's go ahead and talk about the Sever Necromancer. This build wants to do a lot of things which sadly the game tells it time and time again that it can't do. But rather than just sell you on how terrible it is, let's talk about one of the upsides. It's a build that unironically benefits from Ring of Men down because it itself effectively can't do enough damage to kill stuff, but tossing this thing on and having your minions, which are basically fixing just about every single problem that Sever has for itself, at least they can do damage for you. So if you've been waiting for a build that uses Ring of Men down, apparently this is the build for you. Well, what's the point of a build guide video that where I'm mostly just trying to tell you to not play the build? Well, this is effectively not to educate you on how to play this build. It's really just a love letter to the developers. And the fact that Sever has sadly fallen so far by the wayside, has received almost no new tools or compatibility or viability or competitive edge, and has always been in this weird niche where it is a shadow darkness skill that doesn't benefit from dots in any way, shape, or form, is a ramping damage build but doesn't do any initial or upfront burst damage, so all of it is backloaded, and by the time the monsters are done being CC'd, you haven't even finished getting all your buffs up and active. And in a season where unique items are already so hard to fit onto builds, the loss of power and required stats to make the actual skill itself work, in light of using things like Ring of Men down and Sacrilegious Soul, or even its own unique boots, the Grease of the Empty Tomb, feels terrible when you're attempting to solve the issues of the build and the tools that you have are all the weakest possible options for doing those things. Now, that being said, there are some upsides to Sever. It's not a joke when I say I think it's the coolest looking Necromancer build on the planet. Every single time you shoot out your just spinning scythe, absolute madman raper, and it goes chopping through monsters and comes back through, feels very good. On top of that, it excels in places like the Helltide, one of the most favorite places to be farming right now, because you can add on a ton of those lower power uniques and effectively fully automate the build. Black River with Sacrilegious Soul and Lidless Wall means that you could just stand in the middle where the Blood Maiden spawns, hold down the Sever button, and have infinite essence, infinite bone storms, never die, your minions will handle everything for you, and that's quite literally where the value of the build ends. This thing can't push into the pit, it lacks survivability, it lacks damage uptime, it lacks ways of automating its buffs, it lacks way of reducing its own cooldowns, and in fact, while trying to figure out how to make this build work, I just sat down and made a list of pros and cons, and the list of pros didn't really need a lot of time to finish it. That's right, I even found a way of making a list of pros and cons able to be put into a data sheet, because these are equations or issues that the build has that we need to try to solve for. So let's talk about the pros. It quite literally looks cool. That's its biggest pro, I'm not joking. That's the best thing about the build. 2, it's decent for speed farming in Helltide and on autopilot, like I just alluded to. 3, it has access to and can enable some of the strongest damage multipliers that the Necromancer has available to it. The Blighted aspect, which increases your damage by 3.4 times total, so a 240% damage multiplier. Damned, which says the moment that you cast a Cursed at all, monsters just take 50% more damage to you. The issue being that this doesn't empower your Shadow Mages at all. That's a whole other conversation. And Grasping Veins. Grasping Veins on an amulet here is going to give you 38% crit chance and a 75% damage multiplier. Now, funnily enough, even though we are trying to make our minions relevant through Mendeln, Grasping Veins works for us, and Mendeln scales through us as well. So we are actually vastly improving Mendeln's damage through Blighted and through Grasping Veins. On paper, all of this should matter. It should add up to something powerful. And then lastly, it has a relevant weapon temper, which was brought up by Sir K in chat because it's, funnily enough, something that the majority of the Necro builds actually can't say they have going for them. But the chance for Sever to cast its projectile twice, and you can get this thing up to like 50%, if you triple crit on it, you can get it even higher, basically means you multiply your total damage output from your core skill by the percentage on this thing. Now let's talk about the cons of the build. And just as a quick sneak peek, I have written down what all of these solves for these cons are, or at least what the build tries to do to resolve them. So it's not just going to be doom and gloom. I'm going to talk you through what we can do to fix it, and then we'll touch back on why it's just not particularly good. The first con is that it needs to proc Shadow Blight. This becomes incredibly hard on single target effects. Now, Shadow Blight requires you to hit a target 10 times. 10 times on a Sever means that you have to cast Sever 3 times, and that'll proc Shadow Blight once. You have to proc Shadow Blight 10 times to get blighted up. So that means that you have to cast Sever 3 times, times 10, 30 times, for it alone to be able to proc Shadow Blight and get you the blighted damage multiplier. Now, we do have a solve for this, and that's why we're using minions in the first place. Both the addition of the aphotic aspect, which makes it so that your warriors now do shadow damage, and your shadow mages themselves can all proc Shadow Blight for you on those same targets. Now they will spread out their procs kind of across a big group of monsters, but we're pixel pulling all the time. So in general, the minions alone are now solving for our Shadow Blight issues. This is where you normally need to fit in like damage over time effects or ultimate shadow on your Bone Storm, or fit in Blighted Corpse Explosion, or even just hard casting the Blight skill. But the minions are solving this issue. So right there, even though Sever itself is crap at triggering its biggest damage multiplier, the minions can fix that for you. It also needs to proc Vulnerable. Now, the interesting thing about needing to proc Vulnerable is that you can actually do this yourself with Sever. Sever has the ability that every third time that you cast Sever, you notice that we'll see a lot of third casts of Sever here, you'll apply Vulnerable for 3 seconds. And since you can generally spam Sever pretty quickly, this can add up very fast. The issue being that that means we would be choosing an enhancement which doesn't increase the damage of Sever. Blight, you just pick an enhancement that says that you do more damage. Blood Surge, you can either just pick one that says you do more damage or that you overpower, thus meaning that you do more damage. Similarly for Blood Lance, you could just pick one that says that you do more damage, and similarly for Bone Spear, you could just say that you do more damage, or you automatically apply Vulnerable every single time that you hit a target with Bone Spear. So Sever is just worse than all of the other options if you choose this, and is harder to apply it than even its contemporary, which is Bone Spear. And the reason why you basically never want to use this, in addition to the fact that we're using minions, is because you can actually get a damage multiplier from Sever itself based off of how many minions that you have. So right now, I have a whopping total of 11 minions. So that enhancement says that I have 22% bonus damage to Sever. Cool, we're gaining scalability. The issue there is that you end up having to rely solely on vulnerability through Plagued Corpse Tendrils. And since Sever is very bad at reducing cooldowns naturally, you really don't have uptime on this. There's also the affix on gear ability to lucky hit chance apply vulnerability, but Sever has the second lowest lucky hit chance, only next to Blood Surge, where it's contemporaries that do very similar things. It's constantly in comparison to Bone Spear, has a 50% base lucky hit chance, where Sever has a 20% base lucky hit chance. So applying Vulnerable through that affix is basically a non-go option on the build. So vulnerability becomes a problem. You can't use your skeletal mages to be able to apply it through cold mages because you desperately need the shadow mages for being able to maintain your Shadow Blight. Here's where you're going to start seeing the issues and the solves for those issues beginning to butt heads a little bit. Our solve for that is actually in the use of the minions themselves. They can proc lucky hit chance through a bug with Decrepify, which it should not be able to do. But on top of that, the aphotic aspect is also bugged, and whenever they stun targets, they proc Decrepify. So we get to rely on 2 different bugs, which shouldn't be in the game, to be able to further reduce cooldowns and have better uptime on Corpse Tendrils. The issue with spamming Corpse Tendrils for your vulnerable proc is that applying hard CC that quickly will cause your elite monsters to become unstoppable, and now they are a threat to you again. And this is an incredibly squishy build in Season 4. So the solve for applying vulnerable makes you literally just be in more dangerous situations more often. Oh, and in addition to this, and I'm just going to touch on it very quickly, the third bug that we're also relying on to be able to manage our cooldown is the fact that Reaper Skeletons, and I'm currently sitting in front of it, but Reaper Skeletons generating corpses, which Sever is also terrible at doing because, again, the low lucky hit chance happens to also reduce your cooldowns. So the third solve for cooldown reduction is also relying on a bug. So we need 3 bugs to make Sever kind of capable at applying its biggest damage multiplier or vulnerability, something that it's supposedly supposed to be able to do naturally based off the skill's identity. This issue, playing on controller forces you into close combat for optimal damage application, which leads to survivability issues. That one has an easy solve, obviously, right? You just play on keyboard. The issue being that it's still not great on mouse and keyboard, because the actual missile itself will get interrupted by stairs and can't go around corners and gets hard stopped on edges of maps. So in this case, I'm literally just choosing to play the build at a lower than stellar quality because I'm playing on a controller, but I got carpal tunnel. And oddly enough, I think that build shouldn't really be hamstrung by accessibility features or an inability for the controller to be comparable to mouse and keyboard. But let me just go ahead and highlight that in game for you very quickly. So this is going to be me just casting Sever on mouse and keyboard. I'll point it all the way over here, and my Sever will go all the way over there. It'll go to the furthest reach that you can possibly do on your screen, like wherever you can see. But while holding in a direction, it will only shoot this far. It is basically shooting half the possible distance that it could be, meaning that you're forced to fight in close combat to actually apply the overlapping damage instances of the travel and the double spin. Whereas being able to play on mouse and keyboard, you're at least able to snipe with the skill. And since it travels for longer, it means it has more opportunity to hit more targets. So just straight up an accessibility failure. It's just crap on controller. And the solve is, I guess, have perfectly working hands, which isn't always an option for the player. Sever doesn't have a beneficial aspect for its skill. So if you think about Blood Surge, it has Blood Surges twice, doing a slight bit of reduced damage, effectively nearly doubling your damage output from the actual Nova itself. Bloodlance has multiple aspects that just fully automate Blood Orb pickup and Bloodlance proliferation, vastly improving your damage output. Bone Spear says not only do you apply vulnerable to every single target that you hit, but your bone shards can now pierce vulnerable targets, vastly improving their damage output, and gives you a multiplier of your bone shards damage. Your Blight, which is actually in an interestingly similar position to Sever, where it doesn't have an aspect that actually directly increases how much damage it does, has the Void aspect. So it doesn't take up an offensive slot, and it says you can permanently CC monsters, permanently generating essence from Umbral as long as it's not a boss, and just bully all monsters no matter what situation you find yourself in. It's like one of the strongest aspects that doesn't directly increase your damage, but forces all monsters to always be on top of your Blight pools, thus drastically increasing your damage overlap. What does Sever have? Empowering Reaper says that you have a 25% chance to proc Blight whenever you cast Sever. The Blight will do more damage. That doesn't really matter because we're scaling Sever's damage, not Blight damage here. And this can only happen once every 3 seconds. Since it's only a 25% chance, this is more of a utility. And the idea is that you could put 3 points into Blight to get you down to the 20% damage multiplier. And then basically, since you should be able to like permanently spam Sever on top of a target, especially against like a boss, you can use an aspect slot to gain a 3-second uptime of a 20% damage multiplier that doesn't have 100% uptime for application. So why would I use Empowering Reaper, which says sometimes I will have a 20% damage multiplier, when I can instead use Edge Masters, which says as long as you're at max cap resource, which is basically free in season 4 with how much essence per second and resource cost reduction we can put on our gear, you always have a 20% damage multiplier. Or what if I just used Inner Calm, which says I always have a 10% damage multiplier, but if I stand still for 3 seconds, the same thing I would need to do to have near 100% uptime on Empowering Reaper, I'll have a 30% damage multiplier. But why would I use either of those when I can effectively generate Infinite Barrier off of Ultimate Shadow and using Shielding Storm, and then I could just have a 25% damage multiplier. Even in its best case scenario, Empowering Reaper, the aspect which is meant to be earmarked for Sever use, is strictly worse than any other offensive aspect you could put onto the build, with the very small upside of it very slightly increases how often you trigger Shadow Blight, and you can technically use Void aspect to be able to pull monsters sometimes when you cast Sever, but a crowd control effect that you cannot apply 100% of the time is effectively a crowd control effect that you can't rely on, meaning that you can't use it in a tactical way. So then what is the solve for the fact that it doesn't have a beneficial aspect on your skill? Yep, there's nothing to be done about it. You never use its aspect, and the fact that it doesn't have an aspect goes further to hamstring its ability to be a perfectly viable skill that scales similar to its contemporaries. And to that point, it has poor scaling. What do we do about the fact that it has poor scaling? Yep, it's just a true statement. The thing that I said earlier where it has access to Blight, Damned, and Grasping Veins, some of the most powerful scalers that any build could possibly want. Blight also has access to this, Infinite Mist also has access to this, Shadow Surfer also has access to this. So it's not unique in having these things, but it doesn't have additional scaling, which is available for it. So it's just kind of crap in regards to what you can do against other core skills looking to perform in similar arenas. The next issue that it has is that it's a shadow damage skill. It's a darkness skill, but it's not a dot damage build, meaning that it's hard for you to apply glyph bonuses in ways that other darkness builds, very easily can add on to them. The solve for this one isn't too bad. You can use the Ring of Sacrilegious Soul, and you can use Blighted Corpse Explosion, where you can basically rely on those applying damage over time effects. This helps with Shadow Blight uptime. This helps with the lack of lucky hit chance that the skill has as well. The issue being that fitting on Sacrilegious Soul to a crit focused build that's looking to have as a large of an investment in crit as possible already doesn't have a lot of space to be able to fit these things in. And if you are using Mendel like I am, means that you cannot afford to run both of these unique rings. Both of them hamstring you in your effectiveness too strongly. So you kind of have to use one or the other. So Sacrilegious Soul with Blighted Corpse Explosion also replaces minions, which then counter solves the issue with cooldown reduction in Blighted. So to be able to get the benefits of having dot mechanics on your build, you have to give up the minions, but the minions are solving all the issues that the build has from not being a dot build. It's kind of this weird recursive cyclical nature where being able to put on another tool to solve something for the build would negatively impact what other tools are able to solve better. So you're left with two subpar options that you can't fit onto the same build. Touching on this exact same thing, one of the cons of the build is that it wants to use minions. The issue with wanting to use minions touches again on that vulnerability application, which I talked about earlier, but also directly negatively impacts your survivability. One of the easiest sources of damage reduction on a build at any given time is standalone. 3 points in this gains you 18% damage reduction. Not only that, typically in having minions up, you have to invest slightly in their survivability so that they don't just die in pits above tier 80. And even in tier 80, overlapping damage over time effects still just shred them. But that means that 6 points here, which could either go into the sacrifice bonuses that you can normally get, as well as the damage reduction, is instead being put towards your minion survivability and not towards your own survivability. Similar to this, needing to invest even slightly into their survivability, like picking up the damage reduction node here inside of the cult leader board, further reduces how many points are going directly to increasing the Necromancer survivability as opposed to the minions. So what is the solve for this reality? The fact that you want to use the minions, but they're going to come with a downside. Well, we touched on it. You use the Ring of Mendel to make it so that the minions are less of a detriment and are instead actively increasing your output on your build. And Mendel is a fairly smart and easy solve for this problem. The Ring of Mendel, and never forget this part about it, directly scales off of the Necromancer and has nothing to do with the damage that your minions are doing. As such, investing only into your damage allows you to scale this ring's multipliers, most notably Grasping Veins as well as Blighted, to get serious returns on it. The base damage of this, proccing once every 6 attacks, also naturally fits into wanting to stack crit chance and wanting to stack attack speed on the Necromancer, which would then benefit your minions as well to make them attack faster. And it also helps to offset the survivability issues your minions might have by adding on maximum minion life. The issue here, though, is that none of the stats on the ring help your build to perform better other than the aspect. It doesn't give you crit chance, it doesn't give you attack speed, it doesn't do anything to empower you. The irony here being that since the Ring of Mendel doesn't scale off of your minions, even though the minion attack speed and the minion maximum life obviously will make them stronger, the stats on the ring also aren't even good for your minions. We don't care about the Thorns damage in particular on our build, But on top of that, your minions can't lucky hit chance, and our lucky hit chance is so crap that even with a max roll on this, you're not going to seemingly start proccing lucky hit chance at a much greater rate. So Ring of Mendeln is now outdated in this way, where you can't put on essence cost reduction, you can't fit on crit chance, you can't fit on attack speed for yourself, can't fit on maximum life or intelligence for yourself to further increase your survivability or your damage output. And instead, you are just accepting the fact that this is stronger than an aspect that you could put in the same slot. So it goes further to highlight how Sever really isn't doing a whole bunch. The stuff that you can do to solve Sever's problems kind of are, but it feels bad when you're relying on a thing that doesn't say that you, your character, and your skills do more damage or are better at their primary objective. The second issue with this is that you need incredibly good gear to then get the stats that your ring doesn't have. The next part here is that you both want to be attack speed capped and crit capped. And basically the solve for that is that you need incredibly high stats on your gear. You need to be able to masterwork, and you need to hit greater affixes. Most notably on your gloves, you need Sever, attack speed, and crit chance. And you want all three of those to be greater affixed and to masterwork both on the attack speed and the crit chance at exceptionally high rates. If you are using Grasping Veins on your amulet, that in addition to the Inspiring Leader in our skill tree, and then Bone Storm with its subpar uptime, actually gets you a ton of crit chance. So reaching 100% crit chance, not the worst. Actually hitting large amounts of attack speed when one of your rings doesn't add that stat to you at all, incredibly difficult. So now the build, which isn't very good, now becomes very gear dependent to be able to have the stats necessary to make it less not bad. This is going to seem like a weird con, but oddly enough, Shaco is pretty good on just about every single core skill build. It's good on Blight, it's good on Bone Spear, it's good on Blood Surge, it's good on Blood Lance, but it's not particularly good on Sever. And why is that? Because Sever is incredibly essence heavy, because you need to get to a very high attack speed to make it do decent damage. And even with a lot of essence per second and resource cost reduction, you can still run out of essence. Now, Shaco is very powerful for survivability, gives you a bunch of maximum life and cooldown reduction, which would help to deal with the fact that we can't really rely on Decrepify too much, but it doesn't have essence per second. So all of a sudden you're taking away one of your best tools for being able to maintain maximum DPS uptime for some survivability. The second issue being that it takes up an aspect slot. We're already incredibly hungry for aspect slots because we need to be able to empower our minions to help our build as much as possible. And we need a Photic for the cooldown reduction, etc., etc. So we can't fit all of our survivability aspects on if we do use Shaco, and the best one to kick off would be Shielding Storm, but all of a sudden now you can't survive in those high intensity scenarios with like damage over time, lightning effects like Shock Lance or the Charge Bolts, or just the Goat Shamans and the Naga Shamans just casting infinite like Force Lightning like the Emperor from Star Wars. And basically the solve for this is even more gear intensivity here. You just need to get greater affixed and masterwork crit on essence per second on both your chest and your boots to offset the loss, and kind of just accept the fact that you're gonna lose out on Shielding Storm, which does open up Ultimate Shadow to be a little bit less required on the build for survivability for the purposes of gaining 20% DR. The issue here being in higher tier pits, even that 20% damage reduction isn't going to save you. So fitting on Shaco just requires you to have gear, which would mean that you are running higher tier pits to be able to get it, to then not solve for an issue that you would then have in those higher tier pits. For the build, you need to be able to proc Flesh Eater. Flesh Eater gets you a 40% damage multiplier, as well as Fueled by Death, which gets you a 9% damage multiplier. And the major issue here goes back to the idea of how do you fit in Sacrilegious Ring? And the answer is you can't really do it unless you're doing lower tier content that doesn't require you to have as much DPS. So ultimately, you just have to do it manually. Now, you have to be casting Raised Skeleton to maintain a 100% uptime on a Photic so that you are getting that cooldown reduction, you're applying that stun, you're staggering bosses, etc. So it does build into the natural gameplay, but every single time that you are casting Raised Skeleton just to manage all of the secondary attributes of the build, like the utility parts of your build, you're not actively doing damage. So we can't automate the addition of probably one of the strongest damage multipliers that the build has easy access to. So we have to do them manually, which again is just a DPS loss because you're sitting there spamming Corpse Explosion multiple times or Raised Skeleton in this example to not do anything other than turn on one of your damage multipliers, and that takes time. What this adds on is just another damage window that you have to maintain with Shadow Blight, as well as stagger on a boss, or whether or not Grasping Veins has been off of cooldown, or whether or not you are in like the perfect position and you've already triggered all these things simultaneously, it adds this another weird little jigsaw puzzle piece that doesn't fit in quite well, that just makes it feel clunkier and clunkier, trying to benefit from the things that should be easy for it to enable naturally. I've touched on this before, but it just has terrible lucky hit chance. It has the lowest lucky hit chance other than Blood Surge. It does hit 4 times and it can trigger on each one of those instances, but keep in mind that Bone Spear can trigger off of all of its bone shards and pierces every single target and just has 2.5 times the amount of lucky hit chance, and Blight, which has double the lucky hit chance, can trigger 13 times per cast of Blight, and they all overlap. So what's the solve for this? Yep, it just has terrible lucky hit chance. You can't use lucky hit chance return essence. You can't use lucky hit chance apply vulnerable. You can't use it in places where you would seem like it would be good. I keep being asked, like, why not X Falls? It's not shadow damage over time, so it can't trigger X Falls. Even if you put on Greaves of the Empty Tomb, the proc rate off of Greaves of the Empty Tomb is so low that it actually made me think that they had fixed it and it just didn't proc at all. And after, I don't know, like 50 or 60 casts of Sever, I got a single X Falls proc. So a tool that could add on a ton of like very large scalable crit damage isn't an option for you. The fact that it has such terrible lucky hit chance is just like basically like vestigial bone from back when lucky hit chance needed to be like properly managed, and it's just not been looked at since then. And Sever's inability to apply it at appropriate levels for the skill itself is one of its major damning issues that a lot of people just aren't aware of because you never expect it to work in the first place. The interesting part here is that I put that it lacks crowd control and disengage options. This is most notably just an issue for the Necromancer as a whole. Yes, we have corpse tendrils. Yes, it's amazingly powerful. Yes, if you are using it to apply vulnerable and you trigger it too many times, then monsters become unstoppable. And since we do not have access to any mobility skills, we can't disengage from these areas of threat, and then we further lose out on DPS time. So the reliance on just corpse tendrils, while incredibly powerful, and our inability to basically dodge without having metamorphosis on the build, which comes with its own heap of issues, most notably just like not always having up your evade when you need it, and on top of that not being able to put on another utility aspect to further increase our damage or our survivability, just means that we are hard stuck with using a single tool, which does not do the job the vast majority of the time. And it's on Sever, which again doesn't have lucky hit chance to be able to apply stun from things like Decrepify or Crippling Darkness, really feels this issue to the umpteenth degree and often leads to your death in very dangerous situations because we have no other options. It's hard to stagger bosses on the build. Staggering bosses most notably comes from lucky hit chance on Temper from your gear now, ability to apply Immobilize or Freeze or Stun, Crippling Darkness to be able to apply Stun, being able to trigger Stun from Decrepify. The vast majority of stagger effects that the Necromancer has available to it and makes other builds incredibly powerful are just not options for Sever because of its crap lucky hit chance. Blight just permanently applies crowd control the entire time. You can get really good cooldown reduction through triggering Blight, so you can permanently cast Corpse Tendrils on a boss, which applies a huge amount of stun, and Sever just doesn't have that option available to it. Minions can help with this. Aphotic applies a stun. Your minions will trigger this stun fairly decently well, at least your skeletal warriors will, and that does help. That does apply stun. The issue being with it though is that since it's so many overlapping forms of the same type of crowd control, you get diminishing returns very quickly, and being able to diversify the types of crowd controls that you apply leads to staggering faster. So even our best option, which is now our minions are must-have used on the build, and Aphotic is one of our only ways of doing it other than the Decrepify slow as well as Corpse Tendrils, does mean that we very quickly hit the point where you can't successfully stagger them more than 3 times at an efficient rate, and you better hope you've already killed the boss before you get to that point. The last thing that I'll just talk on here is that Greaves of the Empty Tomb no longer really empower the build in a meaningful way. Greaves of the Empty Tomb should offer a ton to a Sever build. And you'd think like, Mac, what are you talking about? They have movement speed, which is already great. They have maximum evade charges, which I personally prefer as my boot implicit stat. They add on Shadow lucky hit chance, which is cool. That will increase, Sever's lucky hit chance here. So I go from a whopping 21% to a whopping 23% chance. Not bad, not the worst thing ever. But you did notice that I had a bunch of skeletons that just died, and we'll get to that in a quick second. It has damage reduction from shadow damage over time affected enemies. That's really cool. A unique damage reduction stat, something that should help with increasing the survivability of Sever, something that we have lost. The issue being that the only damage over time effect that you can realistically put on the build other than Shadow Bone Storm is the Greaves of the Empty Tomb themselves. And then it has essence cost reduction. Essence cost reduction is nowhere near as valuable as just raw essence per second at these same stat lines. Then you cannot temper these boots, so I cannot add on even more mobility, and I can't add on either a lucky hit stun or a decrepify or corpse tendril size, which helps to make corpse tendrils better for the build, etc. But it does add this damage over time effect of desecrated ground. Now, this would add on a multiplier, so you can have the desecrated glyph, which gives you 15% damage multiplier if you're standing on desecrated ground. It technically adds on shadow damage over time, meaning that not only does it help with lucky hit procs and could enable X falls, but you get to trigger Shadow Blighted a little bit faster, right? That's kind of the idea. These boots are phenomenal, except they're completely outclassed by any other boots right now. And it's most notably because one of those things I just said to you is absolutely a lie, and it's the desecrated ground part. Desecration says while you are standing in desecrated ground, you have 15% damage multiplier for only shadow damage. It's not even you just gain a 15% damage multiplier, so it wouldn't go on to empower Men Down, one of our biggest tools for adding damage. No, it is only shadow damage. Now, what's the issue here? I'm going to go ahead and cast Sever. Did you notice something interesting? This is the desecrated ground effect. Sever does not cast desecrated ground underneath the Necromancer. You have to move onto the desecrated ground every single time that you cast it. It also doesn't leave the desecration on the ground for long enough for it to effectively apply Shadow Blight procs, effectively apply damage. It's only there for 2 seconds. I would have to stagger walk between every single cast, meaning that if I'm right up against a boss, I actually cannot even gain the benefit of the desecrated ground because it literally casts in front of you as opposed to underneath you. So even in this one place where these boots effectively should solve a lot of the problems that I've just illuminated or have pointed out, it doesn't do it because of the functionality of the boots themselves lead you to a situation where you have to interrupt your own damage to be able to benefit from them. And that is just not worth the added micromanaging and attack moving that would be required to be able to get the benefit out of it. And you would instead just use a glyph that either gives you a 10, 15, or even 20% damage multiplier, which are all things that we have available to us in those same Paragon slots. So where does this leave us with the Sever skill? Well, one, after retesting it in Season 4, you absolutely need to use minions, just kind of no question there. They solve too many of the problems for the build. Being able to stack on as much total damage to them as possible, being able to benefit from the Ring of Men Down seems like a very good fix for some of its DPS loss. Keep in mind that you don't want to scale the minions, they just need to survive long enough. The other issue here is that it's just very, very soft. It's a very squishy build, whereas before it could really tank with the best of them because we had 4 damage reduction stats on our pants and on our chest, and then generating a ton of Bone Storms through Lidless Wall, Shielding Storm, and Ultimate Shadow. Basically meant you were unkillable. All of those stats are gone, and now the cracks in just how ineffective barrier generation is without stacking a ton of DR from other sources is just very obvious. And I think that Sever is currently falling into that same obscurity. I think that both Blood Surge and Bloodlance, even potentially Bone Spear, is on the Necromancer. Think about the builds that you're seeing currently push the highest tier pits. They are Minion, Bone Spirit, and Blight. Why does Blight get the easy end of here? Well, it turns out that Ebon Piercer does like 15 times the damage of Blight. So even scaling Blight's damage is actually completely inconsequential to just scaling the Ebon Piercer's damage. So Blight actually has almost the exact opposite issue of Sever, where its build defining unique completely trivializes the like the benefits of the skill itself, and you just proc the amulet at the highest rate possible. But Sever hasn't gotten new tools. Its ability to scale has not been increased. Its damage and clunkiness does not match how much it costs to cast and how ineffective its lucky hit chance is. Yes, I have played it without minions. Yes, it was trash. Yes, it basically just sat there waiting to stack all of its damage multis and then had a very short window where it could apply them and just generally wasn't particularly good. I think that Sever, and overall the darkness skills, in addition to the blood skills, need a complete overhaul on the Necromancer. I'll cover blood later on, but the darkness skills have always been at odds with themselves, where they kind of want to be lucky hit engines, and they kind of want to be crit engines, and they kind of want to be damage over time engines. But it turns out that damage over time and crit and lucky hit chance, you can never really have all three of these things. You can either have two of them. You can either have dot and lucky hit chance, or you can have, well, you can't even have crit and lucky hit chance really anymore. They like just absolutely nerfed Infinimus into the ground, and you can't really have crit and damage over time. So none of these things are really like synergistic with one another in a way that matters. Whereas at least blood and bone just say, if you do blood skills, you do more damage, and bone says, if you do bone skills, you do more damage. Darkness skills basically say, we don't know what we're trying to accomplish, and we're not going to give you the adequate tools to be able to do any of them. So there you go. I'm going to be updating the Sever guide on Maxroll with the findings that I did come from today. Luckily, I had already intuited that minions were going to be the play. I'm basically just going to swap it over to Ring of Mendeln and then just make sure that the stats on the build are appropriately representative of the types of stats that you need, and that you're able to hit all the caps that you would need, like crit and attack speed, etc., so that you are doing the most competent damage that you possibly can. But until they drastically change something, I don't see Sever really performing even in like D tier. I think I'm going to drop it down to F tier. I'm going to wait until I personally play the blood builds just to see how bad they are performing in this season, but at least they will be tanky. But let me know what you think down in the comments. Have you been playing Sever? Have you been having success? Have you thought of something that I haven't? Let me know. I would love to hear from you. And again, this video is mostly just like a huge letter of this is everything wrong with the build. I intend to send off to the developers, because I think that Sever has always been in a really weird place, and it was only in season 3 with the addition of the Seneschal pet that basically did Shadow Blight for you and did damage multipliers for you and did Essence Gen for you, where the build felt good. And nowadays we don't have that, and the game got harder. So sound off down in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If you haven't already subscribed to the channel, I would appreciate it. Throw a like onto this video if you liked it, or throw a dislike on it if you disagree with me. Honestly, it's all engagement. I'm not mad either way. Thank you very much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps you to understand why Sever's not doing particularly good this season, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.